The city of Portland has a fairly distinct skyline, one that periodically changes, but not so much at its head, near the waterfront. The waterfront itself was once lined with buildings, which disappeared one by one over time, and ultimately this area was primarily taken over by Harbor Drive. After the drive's removal in 1974, the area was converted into Waterfront Park, as it exists today, between the Willamette River and the Nadeau Parkway. Since the 1970s, little has changed across the parkway from the park. To the north, there is a mix of buildings, and the same is the case to the south. But right in the middle, at the west side approach to the Morrison Bridge, there's nothing. The area around the bridge's off-ramps was converted into parking once the bridge opened in the late 50s and remains that way to this day. But, had things gone differently, this more open area might look very different today. Upon completion, the 1958 Morrison Bridge's west side approach overtook 4 blocks, leading to the demolition of many old structures, the obliteration of anything standing on the 3-block stretch between First and Front, now Nadeau, and Morrison and Stark, as well as the block between First and Second and Alder and Washington. This created space for traffic to descend down to 2nd Avenue, along with rounded off-ramps leading down to Front Avenue. But when this bridge was completed, it was done with a few particulars to allow for a certain alteration to happen later on, a planned alteration that dates back as far as 1951. In September of that year, a man who should be familiar to you all at this point, traffic engineer Fred Fowler, the man behind the city's one-way traffic system, unveiled an idea that came as a result of a couple years of analyzing the parking situation in the city's downtown area. This plan, complete with a 3D model, was to construct a massive parking structure, but not just any kind of parking structure. Upon the completion of a new Morrison Bridge, of which there had been discussions about that dating back to the late 1920s, a 5-story parking garage would be constructed over the top of this west side approach. And not just that, but the structure would cover 5 city blocks, taking up the space between First and Front and Stark and Morrison, as well as 2 blocks between Alder and Washington stretching back to 3rd Avenue. Hence, when one crossed the bridge going west into downtown, they would end up driving into a tunnel of a parking structure, of which there would be multiple off-ramps they could take if they wished to park their vehicle there. Either elevators or escalators would be built inside the structure to take pedestrians between the different levels. This structure would hold around 3,000 cars and cost approximately $3 million to erect. There would have been nothing like it in the country, and it would have drastically affected the appearance of downtown, especially down by the waterfront. One key problem? This plan could not go into effect until after a new Morrison Bridge was built, which, as we know, wouldn't be completed for another 7 years. At this time, in 1951, nobody knew exactly when the bridge would finally be built, but it was projected that it would take about 2 years to construct. Then there would be the added drama of condemning and tearing down any remaining structures on the blocks where the structure would be built. And only then could construction officially begin. And that's if the city was behind it, which they actually were. Even with Fowler just calling it an idea, the project gained rapid momentum. As different as the idea was, it made a lot of sense at the time. at least on the surface. The 1950s were underway, and a massive increase in car ownership was underway right with it. Even by the mid-40s, Portland had concerns about the future of its parking situation in the downtown area, and by 1951, that had only grown. They knew more and more cars would be coming in and out of town each day, and they needed to prepare themselves. At this time, there were less than 17,000 on and off-street parking spaces in the downtown area, and that just wasn't enough. The need for extra parking was so great that the iconic Portland Hotel would be demolished to create another space for parking. Statistics showed that about 86% of vehicles traveling into the downtown area had come from the east side of the river, making it sensible to have a parking structure at the head of what would be the city's newest bridge. This would allow people to park quick and easy instead of looking around for spots deep in the city. With the main shopping district not far away, people could park their cars and take a short walk to do their shopping. A structure set up here would also hopefully decrease traffic congestion. But until a new bridge came around, this structure was little more than a dream and would fade into purgatory while little changed. But that by no means meant the project was forgotten or discarded. In fact, the idea would exist in a variety of different ways for more than 30 years. And yet, as anyone who's been to downtown can see, it never happened. Come 1953, downtown was in a tight spot, with many efforts being put in place to try and revive the area, with an excess of parking garages not being a top priority. The plan was for an increased emphasis on public transportation that would hopefully decrease the number of cars on the streets. Wishful thinking. The removal of several parking spaces during peak traffic hours helped with the clearance of traffic, but also still made for fewer parking options in the downtown area. It was inevitable that more parking structures would need to be erected, helping keep Fred Fowler's idea alive. But with that idea sitting on the back burner, other ideas were considered, mainly an idea to create a parking structure on the northernmost 4 blocks of the city's South Park blocks between Salmon and Columbia Streets. One stipulation of this plan was that while it would go underground, it would also be 1 story above ground, destroying those 4 blocks of park space. While the plan was to have a park-like space on the top of this structure, complete with connector bridges, one can understand why this project was not met with a lot of positivity, especially by the city's park personnel. While this idea would be stopped in 1954, it was another one that did not immediately go away. The following year, an adjusted South Park project structure was proposed. This one would be completely underground and only cover 1 block between Salmon and Main Street, with the entry point along the east side of Park Avenue. So this is Park. Main is the next street down. And yeah, for their last plan for having a garage be here, the entrance would have been like pretty much kind of just right here. You would have just gone forward and down underground, and that was the problem, was they kept whatever plan they came up with, it involved just wrecking everything that was up here. It would have to be redone, and I don't think anybody supporting parks in this town was down for that. Alas, this project would have still required the destruction of one of the city's park blocks, which would have had to be replaced. This block including the historic 1926 Szymanski Fountain. Another project that just never happened. But while this project was briefly being considered in 1955, this year would bring another welcome announcement. A new Morrison Bridge was finally going to be built. With the planning for this bridge in its early stages, in April specifically, What was needed from county commissioners was a decision on whether the west approach of the Morrison Bridge would be constructed in such a way that a parking structure could be put in later. This would include putting in supports where otherwise permanent earth fill would be put in, and would cost the county $357,000 to make happen. This was a nice chunk of change, but the best alternative in that area was to just convert the area beneath the off-ramps to parking, which would create at most 600 spaces. And in addition to this $357,000 for the supports, the projected cost to build the structure had climbed from $3 million in 1951 to $4 to $5 million in 1955. It was also felt this piece of architecture would take a couple years to build. Despite all of this, the county paid up the $357K, presenting the idea that both the city as well as the county were behind this partial parking solution. The one change to the project was that it would cover 4 blocks now instead of 5, no longer taking up the block of 1st and 2nd and Washington and Alder. And the city made it clear from the beginning that they did not want this to be a tax-funded project, but that it would have to be funded by private parties. A 10-cent increase on parking meters was also considered as a way to make funds for this project. Things were lining up for this mega structure to finally become a reality. But it still had to wait for the Morrison Bridge, with construction on that beginning in late 1955. With things seemingly good to go, nobody, at least outside of the loop, could have foreseen what was going to happen next. And it was honestly kind of awesome, even if it never happened. Come October 1957, with the bridge still months from opening, a new vision of this structure to be built over it was unveiled to the public. At a cost of $8 million, this is what was planned. An ultra-modern building over the Morrison Bridge approach that, yes, would include a parking garage on the lower levels, holding about 2,600 cars, but would include a 320-room hotel above that garage, and on the rooftop, a garden and helipad. At still 4 blocks in size, it looks like a futuristic shopping mall, at least from a 1950s perspective. I gotta say, I would have loved to see this happen, but maybe just in existence for like a few days, like when snow comes to town. And if one's wondering how or why a simple parking garage was being shifted to such a flashy alternative, it just so happened the state of Oregon's centennial celebration was not far away, 1959. The objective was to have this project completed by then, a lofty goal seeing as the bridge would not be completed till mid-1958. There was also reportedly a hotel shortage in downtown, along with the parking issue, which was another motivating factor, but I still think the centennial was the main driving force. May 24th, 1958, and the official opening of the new Morrison Bridge. There was great pomp and fanfare, but for our purpose, the door was finally open for a structure to be erected. The $8 million hotel garage plan was shopped around for a while, but faded away over time. Money certainly may have been a factor, but also, with enough time passing, completing this massive project for the centennial became impossible. At this time, the downtown area also had other matters to deal with. Namely, they were in the early stages of trying to completely revive the South Auditorium District, a project for a while associated with the city's plans to build its first sports arena. This would become the Memorial Coliseum, completed in 1960. Other smaller parking structures were also starting to go up, such as a 10-story building at 4th and Yamhill in 1959. All these things were listed out in a 10-point plan to revive the city, established in October of 1959. Within these points, parking garages were listed while also suggesting as a possibility building one at the West Morrison Bridge approach. No mention of the grandiose garage hotel complex, just a possible parking structure again. Nearly a decade would pass with no changes in the vicinity of the bridge's approach when it started becoming the subject of discussion again in 1968. The land around the bridge's off-ramps had been converted to parking, which was being leased to the county, who was also paying the taxes on it. It was realized that high possible tax revenue was being missed out on with this land sitting as it was, and that building something in that area could change that. By this point, the South Auditorium Urban Renewal Project had already helped the city in terms of increased tax revenue. A short while later, in June 1969, Joseph Labate, president of the Portland Association of Building Owners and Managers, made a new push for something akin to the original parking structure idea. A large parking facility capable of holding 3,000 vehicles in the area around the Morrison Bridge's west approach. Within a couple of months, the large parking structure plan was off and running again, 18 years after its initial introduction, with the city council directly involved, looking to obtain federal funds for a study on the project. Only now, it had shrunk just a little bit, again, now planned to only cover 3 city blocks between 1st and 2nd and Stark and Morrison. To compensate for this, however, some of this parking would be underground, and there would be at least a little flashiness, if you can call it that. Plans were to include store spaces in the structure and possibly office space as well as a restaurant. And nobody could argue against the fact that the parking situation was an ongoing problem, and it needed to be addressed. It was projected at this time that by the year 2000 there would be 200,000 cars passing through downtown each day. A pretty scary number for a city having ongoing parking problems. It seemed there might be too much pressure to not finally make this structure happen. But by this point, 1969, a lot had changed. And with those changes, lingering problems stuck around. And here is where we really see some of the reasons why this thing was just never going to happen. First things first, while the project could have been done for $3 million in 1951, by 1969 the going cost was between 18 and 20 million. The longer you wait, the more expensive it gets. And during this time, other parking structures, albeit smaller, were being completed around town for cheaper costs. A structure to hold 800 cars was being built on the block, surrounded by 6th and Broadway and Yamhill and Morrison. An 11-story building holding 700 spaces was built at 4th and Columbia. Another structure capable of holding 900 cars was being prepped at 1st and Jefferson. With each new, more affordable structure, the need for this behemoth by the waterfront was becoming less and less. And this one was only getting more and more expensive. And that's the other thing, appearance. As the simple parking structure was supposed to be, it would have been this ugly gray block, not just at the front of downtown, but right in the middle of it. Every view of the city's skyline from those approaching or even snapping a picture from the east side would be affected by this massive, charmless building. These other ones were being built off of Front Avenue, so instead of sticking out like a sore thumb, they more or less blended in with the buildings around them. This was always the key factor casting a shadow on this project. It simply would have made the city look uglier. It's important to also realize that by this time, early efforts were in place to try and convert the waterfront to a more pedestrian-friendly area. Hopes were to convert it into a park, and by 1974's removal of Harbor Drive, those possibilities only grew. While the waterfront park would add a touch of charm to the very front of the downtown area, the last thing people wanted was a big parking structure right across the street in the middle of it all. And this is something that bothered me from the get-go, and I feel this would have become more and more of an issue over time. In 1969, Commissioner Jim Neal felt that having a structure holding 3,000 vehicles would become overwhelming and cause further congestion at given times. That's where I felt problems could arise, especially during rush times. Lots of cars arriving at the same time or departing at the same time, and lots of them flooding in from the bridge, and others trying to flood onto the bridge. While I cannot speak for the specifics in terms of where the ramps in and out of the structure would have been, since it was never built, I think, regardless, there would have likely been serious congestion issues with this place's setup. Maybe I'm wrong, but somehow I doubt it. Something else would happen in 1969. The establishment of the Tri-County Metropolitan Transportation District of Oregon, or, as we know them, TriMet. TriMet would pick up the slack for a dying Rose City Transit Company, which, established in 1956, had been carrying the torch for a city desperate to increase its public transportation ridership. And it was hoped TriMet would make a better go of it in a city where, by 1970, downtown's acreage was 30% parking, that equaling about 80 blocks worth of land. In a February 1970 editorial, the city's lagging efforts to truly instill some changes were called out, with one passage stating, "The city has no choice but to accept the crush of traffic, perpetuating the problem through providing more facilities for the automobile, rather than working towards more efficient and economical rapid transit. The city, at least up until now, has catered to the pressure of the motorist." And I have a hard time arguing with that sentiment, since it seemed most of the solutions presented at this time were of the short-term band-aid variety. Sure, you can keep building parking structures to keep up with the increase in people and their vehicles, but where does that get us the further down the road we go? And yet, at the same time this was all happening, a Dick Lakeman of the city's planning commission expressed his confidence that a parking structure over the Morrison Bridge approach would happen before the end of the 70s. Somehow this thing just kept sticking around. By 1976, TriMet would actually take over some of the street-level parking in this area as a sort of park-and-ride, where they had a free shuttle to bus people around downtown who parked there. And this was 2 years after a comprehensive plan was put in place to redevelop downtown, which included, yet again, the hopes for a parking structure of some kind to be built in the vicinity of the Morrison Bridge. 1976 also brought on an $8 million project to build 2 more smaller parking structures, both of which would be built in the vicinity of Morrison Street. One replaced the old Blue Mouse Theater at 4th Avenue between Morrison and Alder, just 2 blocks from where the Morrison Bridge on-ramps began. Come 1978, the area around the bridge's west approach was considered as a possible site for a new convention center. But still, even on into the 1980s, the parking garage saga would not die. In the summer of 1984, a study was called for in terms of how to redevelop this area around the bridge's off-ramps and its surrounding areas. Shocker, the conclusion reached about the west approach was something parking related. Only in this case, the off-ramps leading down to Front Avenue would be removed, opening up 2 blocks on each side of the bridge, which would both be converted into smaller parking structures. An overpass or underpass could then give these people access to Waterfront Park. But again, who wanted a bunch of parking structures across the street from the waterfront? There had also been more firm restrictions put on buildings at this time, making a parking structure an even harder sell. There was also a prevailing attitude that anything in this area should be compatible to other nearby historical structures. This would have also forced all of the bridge's traffic to access it at 2nd and Alder going east or 2nd and Washington going west. All that traffic coming in from Front Avenue would have had to force their way into all this, and talk about a traffic headache, especially at rush times. And by this time, this project would have cost in excess of $25 million to make happen. Nah, this thing was just destined to never happen. And with the passage of time, something like this would have just become more and more distasteful to locals. That's probably why, as far as I've gathered, 1984 was the last serious push to make this parking project happen. And by then, it was a completely different idea anyway. And had it ever successfully been built, I get the feeling that by now it would have been demolished. So all in all, it probably wouldn't have lasted very long. It's just something so fascinating. Something that never was, and yet for so long it was a lingering possibility. And had it happened, it would have completely changed Portland's downtown appearance to something that's a little hard to fathom nowadays. I'm sure over the course of time I'm going to stumble onto a lot of other stories that are very similar to this one in terms of what did and didn't happen. But this story is also one of so many about the possibilities that never were and the what ifs. Thoughts not just about what could have been, but how what is may have changed or simply been different. This instance serves as a solid example for all the ways a city can end up looking vastly different than how we know it.